Good morning. Welcome to this session on accessibility. I'm Stella Collins, Chief Learning Officer and co-founder of Stella Labs, and I am really excited to be here with Susi and Mike to actually really help us understand what you can do to be accessible. At Stella Labs, we're very into being brain friendly, and one of my colleagues who has a neurodiversity says that it's really important to think about accessibility because whilst people with certain differences to the norm struggle with things, they are actually the canary in the mine for the rest of us. Because actually, if things aren't accessible, we may feel we can cope with it, but actually it's diverting our brains from the things we really want to do. It's giving our brain additional effort, additional work that it doesn't need. So I am really excited to find out what Susi Miller and Mike Osborne are going to share with us today. And I know they're going to get you involved, so I really invite you to join in with everything they do. And we'll just give a couple more seconds for everybody to get in. And I'm going to hand over to Susi and Mike.
Perfect, thank you, Stella. So, hi everyone, I'm Michael Osborne from Upskill Digital. Upskill themselves are very big on diversity and inclusion, and accessibility for me is more of a passion piece, so something I've always been passionate about. I myself am neurodiverse, so I have got a mild form of Tourette's, so if you do notice any motor or vocal tics during the session, just that gives you a little context why. I have presented a number of times on this topic. I've also done a few podcasts on the subject as well. And this is my first in-person delivery on something of this scale, so please bear with me today.
Yeah, I would say bear with me as well. So I think whenever you're standing up here, all of your kind of neurodiversity comes to the fore. So my name's Susi Miller. I am an e-learning instructional designer. I also specialise in e-learning accessibility, and I've also recently written a book on designing accessible learning content. So I'm known as an author now, which is also quite scary as well. So that's me in a nutshell.
Sure, so what I wanted to do just now is to take a moment to introduce to today's agenda. So this is what we have on the agenda today. So we're going to start off by giving a definition of accessibility, just to make sure that we are all working off the same page. Once we're done with that, we will be moving into an activity which will give you an opportunity to experience some potential accessibility barriers for yourselves, really to lay the context of understanding what it is, why it's important, before we then go into some practical accessibility tips, obviously in the learning space. And yeah, we really want to take the opportunity to understand why it is that to make your content more accessible. So towards the end of the session, we will summarize with some key takeaways, and then there should hopefully be some time for Q&A at the end. You'll also notice on your seats there are some flyers. Everything we are covering in today's session is you'll find in those flyers and more. So obviously accessibility is a massively broad topic. We can't cover everything in the 60 minutes we have with you. But please do refer to those flyers as we go throughout the session. So as I said, I'm going to start off with a definition of accessibility. And the reason for that is when speaking on accessibility, people often misunderstand us, so they often think of accessibility as easily obtained or easily used, or is the content easily understood and appreciated. But what we're going to do today is to talk about accessibility as defined by the W3C, so the World Wide Web Consortium, who say that accessibility means that people with disabilities can equally perceive, understand, navigate and interact with your content. It also means they can contribute equally without barriers. Now, the key thing in this definition for me is really without barriers, because those barriers affect somewhere between 12 and 26% of the population. And if we're not designing with those people in mind, we're excluding a massive potential of the audience, all of which need to be catered for. So I head over to Susi now for an activity just to get us straight in.
Okay, So many thanks, Mike. So what we're going to do now is move the focus away from the kind of starting off with that definition of an accessibility, I think is really important. But what we want to move now onto really is an activity and something that is really going to help make accessibility come alive for all of you. So what we're going to do is ask you in a moment to take part in this activity. And the idea really is to get you thinking about accessibility and really the impact that it has on people. So we're not going to be starting off by looking at the principles and looking at the standards. What we're going to do is make you really think and shift into thinking about how accessibility affects people. So what we're going to do, ask you to do in a moment is start with this activity. You can see it has a really helpful name that you can see there, the user in your face. It's basically designed to be a challenging activity. It has got lots of frustrations and barriers that Mike was talking about. So what I'd like you to do is, it's basically, I need you all to have a mobile device. And it's designed by a digital agency in Belgium. And as I say, it's designed to be very challenging for you. So really all it is a web form that you need to fill in as quickly as possible. So in a moment, Stella is going to start by giving you, she'll tell you, she'll give you a 5-minute timing that she'll want you to do. So really the idea is to fill this web form in as quickly as you possibly can. So hopefully you'll be all beating your neighbours, and we might actually have some people within the room who finish that activity. So you can see here that you've got the QR code on the screen. So I just want you to use that to access the activity. And then, as I say, in a few moments, Stella, once you're all ready, Stella will give you the warning of when we're going to start the timing. Okay, so as I say, just give you a minute to get started.
I see some laughs in the audience already, which is really great.
Okay, I can see some people are already having a go at doing it, but I can see that there are other people who are looking at me in a slightly strange way. Maybe some people who might not be able to access that activity that I've given you. So I've deliberately, which is a really difficult thing to do as a trainer, it's really difficult to start you off an activity knowing that some people will not be able to do the activity. So what I want you to do, I know some of you have started already, even though I haven't said that stop clock watch has been started. So I want you to stop and I want you to pause, okay? And I want you to think of who it is that we have excluded from doing that activity. There will be some people in the audience who are not able to do that activity, and I want you to have a think about who they may be. So again, I'll just give you a moment or two to pause and have a think. Okay, and then I will give you some of the ideas that we thought when we were thinking of who we would be excluding. So first of all, we could be excluding anybody who doesn't have a mobile device with them today. Now, that's quite unusual in a conference such as this. Most people do have mobile devices, but that is something that could be the case. Equally, we're quite lucky in this venue, I know, to have good internet connection, but that could be something else that would actually exclude someone from doing this activity. Both of those are examples of the digital divide. Another thing that might have tripped people up was asking you just to look at the QR code. So I know in my case, I would struggle to use a QR code to actually access that activity. Probably not the case for many of you, but certainly would be the case for me. So the technical ability or that I kind of like how technical you are might be something that would actually prevent you from doing it. The other thing that I said was that we were going to make it a competitive activity. So I deliberately said I want you to try and finish it as quickly as you can and beat the people that you're sitting next to. Now, for some people, that is really difficult. That kind of challenge of having to do a competitive activity can be really a barrier to them. And finally, thinking about people who have access needs. So those access needs could be permanent access needs. It could be someone, for example, who has low vision or who is blind and who is not able to interact with that activity. It could be someone who has a temporary access need. So, for example, someone who's broken their wrist and is not able to actually access and interact with that content. Or it could be someone with a situational impairment. Someone for me, very common for me, is to forget my reading glasses and therefore not be able to interact with that content. So what I'm going to do now is do that again. We're going to start again that activity, but I am going to this time give you a much more inclusive approach. So if you would like to have a go at doing that activity, you can see that you can open a browser on your device, and there is the URL there, userinyourface.com, very easy to remember if you want to have a go at it after the session. So you can do that if you want to. You can have a go at doing it if you find that you do have access barriers or there are any issues that stop you from doing it, then please stop and maybe just have a think about what it was that caused you to stop. What was it that actually was the barrier that stopped you from doing it? And if that's the case, then maybe just have a think about some of the barriers that you've encountered in the past. If you don't want to do it at all, absolutely fine. Maybe, as I say, just have a think about some of those barriers. If you want to do that yourself, or if you want to speak to someone next to you, absolutely fine. If you're working next to someone and you want to just watch them do it, again, that's another option. So that is a much more inclusive approach to that activity. So again, I'm going to just pause for a minute or so, and if anyone has any questions, then please let us know. Otherwise, just decide what you're going to do in the next 5 minutes as we run that activity. Okay, everyone all right? Everyone know what they're going to do? All happy? Brilliant. Okay, in that case, I know some of you I can see are already still doing the activity, which I know is really difficult not to. But Stella, would you start the 5-minute clock for us?
Started.
Okay, you've got 5 minutes. We said we were going to have a wander. Did you finish?
I'm colourblind.
Oh, you're colourblind. Oh, how interesting. So can you not see the text at all?
I can see now when I can see the logo.
That's so interesting. I hadn't even thought of
Any
that.
questions at this stage, or are we all good?
No, not at all. No,
Okay.
but that's exactly is one of the ones that we'll talk about later.
Yeah.
So there, that's
Yeah, no, it's
brilliant.
no problem.
Yeah, no. Can I just ask what your name is?
Ross.
As Susie has already pointed out, it is designed to be deliberately challenging. So if you are struggling, please don't feel silly. But hopefully you'll get an idea of some of the frustrations that people with some disabilities might encounter if they're interacting with this.
Timing, Stella?
How are you doing for time?
3:58 minutes still to go.
As you're going through the exercise, please start also think about some of the barriers that people with disabilities might encounter. I think that'll help. We will obviously talk through these as we go through the session and touch upon these as we give our tips, but just be in that frame of mind thinking what people might find difficult. How are you feeling? You frustrated?
You can see some people helping each other, which is really nice. Apologise.
2 minutes left.
Really? That goes slowly, doesn't it? That goes slowly, that 5 minutes.
Should we see if people want to continue? Or?
I think we're okay, yeah.
Okay.
Just got 1 minute left, I think. Okay, see people giving up now.
Did anybody manage to complete the challenge?
Oh, I'm just about to say
Oh, there is a hand up. Sorry. Go on, Susie.
that's fine.
Still more than a minute left.
I think we'll stop now, shall we? Yeah, okay, I think everyone happy to stop? Okay, so taking over from Mike's question there, did anyone actually manage to finish that activity? Brilliant. We've got one person at the back. A couple of people who did. Brilliant. If you didn't and you want to have a go at doing it after the session, then it's very addictive, so I completely understand. So if you did finish it, you can see that you are, and you probably got to this screen if you did finish it, you are in fact a true interface legend if you actually did manage to finish it. I know that when I did it myself, you can see I don't think that's the first time I did it, but it certainly took me at least, I don't know, 15, 20 minutes to actually get through the frustration of doing that activity. But as you probably guessed, the purpose of doing the activity wasn't really to get you to have this competition of seeing who could finish more quickly. What it was to try and get you to think about the way that people are interacting with digital content and to have an experience of some of those frustrations. So really what it was trying to get you to do was to start to think empathetically, and that is at the very heart of what accessibility is all about. So all of those, the activities that you did, the idea was really that you were thinking about the frustrations that people would have experienced. So if you take nothing at all apart from this, away from this session, I want you just to think about the frustration that you might have felt. Whether that was at the beginning when we had an activity that maybe some of you were excluded from, or maybe it was when you were actually doing the content itself, when you were going through that activity. I want you to bear in mind that frustration that you went through and imagine how that feels if we translate that into what we all do and if it's looking at learning content. So imagine that frustration if it's learning content, not filling in a web form that you're thinking about. Now that frustration could be in an educational setting, it could be in further or higher education, or as many of us also are involved in a workplace setting. So imagine if you were accessing or trying to access learning in a workplace setting. So if you've just, for example, joined an organisation and your onboarding training is not accessible to you, or you have to find out about your health and safety in your organisation to keep yourself safe, and that learning is not accessible to you, or you want to find out how you can actually improve your career, how you can develop, how you can actually find out how to do your job, and that learning is not accessible to you. So that is what I want you to take away from this session, as I say, if you don't take anything else at all. So the other thing that I hope that may have done for you, doing that activity, is trying maybe to reframe the way that we think about accessibility. So obviously, at the very heart of accessibility as well, is finding out how we remove barriers for people who have disabilities. So this question, that we're probably quite familiar with, this is kind of an HR question, do you consider yourself to have a disability, is obviously really important from the point of view of accessibility. But if we slightly reframe that question, and if we say, for example, do you consider yourself to have an access need rather than a disability? And if you maybe don't consider yourself to have an access need now, is it possible that at any point in the future you could have an access need? And I think it's very, very clear that the answer to that would be yes for everybody. So what we want to do is really move the focus away from this kind of us versus them idea of accessibility and think of accessibility instead as being just an us issue. So accessibility is something that benefits all of us. It can benefit all of us at any time, and it also benefits all of our learners as well. So as I say, slightly reframing the way that we might be thinking about disability without at all taking away the emphasis that accessibility is all about helping to break down barriers for people who do have disabilities. Okay, so what we'll do now is move on to looking at what we've just learned, what we've just experienced, and how we can make that work for us in the learning that we're actually creating. So looking at practical accessibility now. So the first question that we need to answer every time we're talking about accessibility is how do we find out actually how to make our content accessible? And really the answer to that lies in these scary-looking principles and scary-looking standards that you have up on the screen here, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Now, the reason that those are considered to be kind of the best practice is because they do underpin the majority of legislation on digital accessibility. So if you are trying to find out how to make your content accessible to a legal standard, you need to go to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. But even if that's not the case, they still are considered to be the best practice. So for example, in the UK, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines underpin both the Equality Act and more recently the Public Sector Bodies Accessibility Regulations, which were introduced in 2018. So really important key pieces of information that point to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So a couple of things that you probably need to know. If you are trying to make it legally compliant, then it's really the version 2.1, the most up-to-date version that you're looking at. That means that and again legally from the levels A and AA, A is the basic level, and AA is the kind of intermediate level. And that really is the underpinning of most legislation. But again, even if it's not legislation, it's considered to be best practice. If you want to reach the pinnacle, if you want to reach the advanced level, then that's your AAA standard. And you can see there are 28 standards there. So you're looking at 78 standards that you need to be applying to make your content accessible. So you can understand why a lot of people who come to accessibility and get pointed to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines just panic and think this is completely overwhelming. How on earth am I going to make my content accessible to all of these guidelines? So what we try and do, one of the things that we try and do is just break it down and make it easier. So one of the things that I do in my own practice, and this is really where where the book came from, was to start with an accessibility framework, an e-learning accessibility framework, which just really gives you the opportunity of changing the web content accessibility guidelines from those scary looking lists into a contextual framework that is relevant for what we do as learning practitioners. So the type of things that you might need to know before you start setting up your project, before you even get going. What you need to do, what you need to find out, for example, about images, what you might need to know about formatting, what you might need to know about moving content, about audio and video content, for example. So you'll see that the tips that we're going to give you later when we start going into depth about how to apply accessibility, you will see that they'll be cross-referenced both to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, but also they also have the reference to the e-learning accessibility framework, if anybody's familiar with that and using that. But actually, although that's a great start, if you're actually getting into the nitty-gritty of applying accessibility, for the purposes of this session, what we're going to do is simplify things even more. And we're going to look at accessibility from the lens of different types of access needs. So at this point, what we need to do is maybe again be slightly rethinking some of the assumptions that we have about accessibility. So still, I think a lot of people, when they think about accessibility, the first thing that springs to mind is people who have visual access needs. So maybe people who are low vision or are blind, very often people who are screen reader users. So that's what we tend to typically think of when we're trying to make our content accessible. But we need to think wider than that. So we need to be aware of some more of the different types of access needs that we need to consider. So to do that, I'm going to show you a video, and that will hopefully make you think slightly differently about or make you aware really of the different types of considerations that we need to be aware of. So the video is taken from Apple. It's really a showcase of their inclusive technology. And your task for this activity is really just to watch the video and to see if you can identify as many different types of access needs as you can. I also want you just to bear in mind that because the video has sound, unfortunately we did try, but we didn't quite manage to get captions for the whole of the session. The video does have captions, so at least we've managed to make that accessible. It also has a lot of content, which is visual content, who somebody who has low vision may miss. So it also has audio description. So this is an example of making that video as accessible to everybody as we possibly can. So as I say, what we'll do is I'll play it for you now, and I just want you to see if you can note as many different types of access needs as I play it for you.
In a kitchen, we move to an open bedroom door. In the bedroom, Sadie Paulson is reflected in a mirror. A caregiver brushes her hair, then helps her into a blouse.
People think that having a disability
Sadie sits at a desk working with an iMac. She moves her head to operate switches on her headrest.
But that's not the way I see it.
Now, a young man uses sign language on a FaceTime call.
You can catch up with friends.
A young woman signs back. Now a family picnic.
You can capture a moment with your family.
One face, small face, focus lock.
A blind man takes a photo with an iPhone.
And you can start the day bright and early.
A woman lies in bed using an iPhone app to open motorized curtains and turn on her lights. She lowers herself into a
You
wheelchair.
can take a trip to somewhere new.
A man hikes with friends. Now a close-up of his hearing aid. He stops to select the outdoor setting on his iPhone.
3 miles to the summit.
A boy reads a book on an iPad in class.
You can concentrate on every word of a story.
A bird began to sing. Jack opened his eyes.
An athlete selects outdoor wheelchair workout on her Apple Watch.
You can take the long way home.
A beach at sunset. The athlete pushes her wheelchair aggressively down a paved path, quickly gaining speed. Then the footage rewinds, revealing that it's being edited in Final Cut Pro.
Or edit a film like this one.
We zoom out to reveal Sadie editing the film. She uses her head to use switch control, navigating an on-screen keyboard.
When technology is designed for everyone,
She drags a clip and plays the film.
it lets anyone do what they love, including me.
Sadie laughs. Then a gray Apple logo appears on a white background. The logo disappears.
Okay, so I hope you agree with me just what a fantastic video that is really for challenging assumptions, challenging the way that we think that people with disabilities, what they're able to achieve. So for me, it's one of my favourites. So as I say, hopefully that got you started to get you thinking about different types of disability that we need to be aware of. But to make things slightly easier, what we're going to do now, again, that sometimes is a great introduction, but it can sometimes feel a bit overwhelming when you think, goodness, how on earth am I again going to make my content accessible for all of these different types of access needs? So what we'll do is simplify it a little bit further, and we'll break it down into 4 different categories. So those categories are vision, hearing, motor, and cognitive. Okay, and again, they're quite obviously fairly artificially neat categories, but again, they're a really good starting point for us if we're trying to make sense of accessibility and have something to hang it on when we're actually trying to apply it practically. So another activity that I want you to do now is to have a think of those 4 categories and see if you can think of somebody that you know who has some access needs that might fall into one of those categories. So again, the purpose of doing that is to try and move away from accessibility, from just being these technical standards, and bringing it back to being about people. So think of somebody that you might know, might be yourself, it might be someone that you work with, someone in your family, it might be someone famous, and just trying to think which of those categories their access need would fall into. You might notice that the motor topic has got a mouse as the icon, and that's really just from a digital point of view, so that you're aware that that is for people really with manual dexterity issues, so people who may be accessing content rather than using a keyboard, rather than using a mouse and maybe on a mobile device using fingers, they're using assistive technology to access content in a different way. So again, have a think about any of those categories, the person where that person would go, and then see if you can think of any disabilities or conditions that would fit into the other 3 categories. So just have a think again. Okay, so what we'll do is I'll just give you some examples of some of the things that we typically get, particularly when we do that in training. So from a vision point of view, you could have blindness, you could have low vision, you could have colour blindness. So somebody who was doing the activity, it was Ross, was it? to suddenly point my finger at you was something that people quite often forget when they're thinking about accessibility. Is colour blindness is really important. There's lots of standards in the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines around making things accessible for people who are colourblind. And in that activity, that blue and the red the blue and the green contrast actually meant that for some people it was impossible to read the text completely because of colour blindness. So that's just something to be aware of. And then we have some specific conditions. Sometimes people, for example, come up things like glaucoma or cataracts when it comes to actually the conditions that cause the vision access needs. Hearing, it could be deafness, hearing loss, and again, some conditions, or acoustic trauma, tinnitus, auditory processing disorder. Motor, again, coming back to this idea of the way that you're interacting with content. It could be loss or damage of limbs, things like arthritis, MS, RSI, cerebral palsy, a whole range of different conditions. The cognitive category is probably the widest group of different types of access needs, I think. So, for example, it could be something like a learning disability such as Down syndrome. It could be, I think, Stella, you were talking about neurodiversity, so really common, things like dyslexia, ADHD, autism, for example. It could be things like epilepsy, which are affected by moving content, by flashing content, and things like a whole range of mental health issues like depression, which can also affect people's cognitive ability. So that's really just a setting the scene of the types of things that the whole range of things that we need to be catering for and we need to be thinking about. Okay, so what we'll do then is start off by having a look at how we are actually going to make this a reality in our learning content. So we're going to look at some tips for each one. And as Michael said, the tips are all on the handouts that you have. So we're just going to focus on a couple of the key ones, but I think there's 5 for each of the different categories in that handout.
Brilliant, thank you, Susie. So the 2 standards, we're going to start with vision, and the 2 standards we've chosen here are colour contrast and alternative text. Some of you may be familiar with this already, but we'll go into this in a bit more context. So let's start with the focus on colour contrast, thinking back to the activity that you ran earlier. Let's get a show of hands on whether people think there is a good contrast between the background and the foreground text. Pretty clear, pretty decisive that the consensus is no. But that leads us into how do we actually understand this? And this is where guidelines come in as useful. So one of the things that the web guidelines, as Susie has stated, tell us is that the colour contrast ratio between text and the background needs to be at a ratio of 4.5 to 1. And how do we find out if this is actually the case? So if you go onto Google and you Google some colour contrast checkers, you'll discover a number of tools which you can actually use. One popular one we've chosen here is the WebAIM tool, which you can access using the URL shown. So if you're using the tool, all you need to do is to take the colour codes of the text and the background. You enter them into the tool, and it will tell you whether you're actually meeting the required guidelines for accessibility. Now, in terms of grabbing those colours, you can use some tools like Microsoft as an example. You can also use some colour grabbers as well, and those will actually tell you whether you're meeting the guidelines or not. So, as we all identified, the colour contrast in the user interface example, fell the contrast for both normal and for large text. And the good thing is, so good colour contrast affects everyone, and it's one of the easiest things that we can actually implement in the design of our learning programs. We'll now move on to another key requirement, and that's designing for people with visual impairments, so non-visual learners, which is alternative text. So alternative text, or alt text as it's otherwise known, is a way of describing an image to learners who can't actually see the image. And these are used by tools such as screen readers, which give people using screen reading software an image description of what the content contains, and also text to braille, so people can fill out to discover what the content is as well. Some of you might be familiar already about adding alt text in your solutions, but did you know that using tools like Twitter, if you're talking about the event today, or Instagram, you can actually add alt text to your images. And what we need to do when creating alt text is to basically give the learner context of what the image is describing. And if there's any questions on that at the end, do feel free to either reach to myself or Susie. So the alternative standard, there are 2 important principles when it comes to alt text. The first is that the content needs to be, give the user meaning of things, to give them the context. And the other is to hide anything that is marked as decorative. So if you have images such as logos, which are appearing on every slide, or some background art, those need to be hidden, because if you don't, a screen reader will pick that up and it will read the image file name, which is an incredibly frustrating experience to anybody using screen readers. And to actually to mark an image as hidden, you simply need to use double quotations which will then hide that image for people using screen readers or for using Braille. And as an example here, in a piece of software which many of you might be familiar with, which is Articulate Rise, all you need to do to add alt text is to select the image. If you go to then settings, you can actually add some alt text to the image and enter that text description. Also, to hide an image from screen readers, as we say, we simply need to add the double quotations, which is important in your course to make sure that screen readers won't actually recognize the image. So hopefully you found those two tips useful, and we're now going to move on to hearing considerations. So for hearing considerations, one of the things we've picked up on, as demonstrated in the video earlier, is adding captions to video and audio content. Now, to make our captions effective, they need, as defined by the web content guidelines, there are a few important things that people need to be aware of to consider. The first is that the captions have to be synchronized to the video. And the reason for this, as demonstrated in the video we watched earlier, is that gives anybody with disabilities an equal, almost like-for-like experience for those who don't have the challenges. So a nearest possible equivalent for other learners. And it's also a key reason why providing a transcript alone isn't enough to meet the web guidelines. Another thing to be aware of is that with the content guidelines is that both the captions must be descriptive, and they must also include things like audio cues. It might be a phone ringing in an example, or it might be if somebody's particularly upset, if you want to convey emotions, you want to take the added layer not just based on what people are actually speaking, but to include anything that people who couldn't necessarily hear the audio might not pick up. So emotions, sound effects, those are all common examples. The final consideration is that, to be aware of, is that your captions must be accurate. So it really isn't enough to rely on automatic captioning software such as you might get in YouTube, anyone editing videos and things like Adobe Captivate. You know, the AI is good, but it isn't there yet. I don't know if anybody have used live captioning in things like Microsoft Teams, but you probably notice sometimes it doesn't always pick up, particularly with some strong accents. You know, so everything does need to be thoroughly checked to be edited to make sure they're actually accurate. So again, here's an example of what you might need to be aware of as an e-learning practitioner. And this time we're looking at a piece of software called Lectora, an authoring tool. And this shows how caption files can actually be uploaded. So, but what I'm going to do now is actually head over to Susi, who's going to talk us through motor and cognitive considerations, and we'll take any more questions, as I say, at the end of this time. So here we go.
Thank you. Brilliant, thank you, Michael. So moving on to motor considerations. So the one key principle that we've chosen for motor considerations is the fact that we need to make sure that all the functionality that we use in our learning resources is keyboard accessible or keyboard compatible. So it is such an important principle in accessibility that this is the reason that we've chosen to focus on this one. And I think one of the reasons that I really wanted to focus on this particular principle is because I think it is one of the ones that really challenges our assumptions about how people are interacting with content. And it also challenges our assumptions of what people are able to achieve. So this is an example of somebody who is using a head stick and using a standard keyboard on their laptop to access content. So they're basically working with a website and just using that assistive technology to make sure that they can access content. And another key example, which we'll move to now, is Sadie Paulson, the amazing Sadie Paulson, who was actually editing the film that we watched earlier using switch technology and a keyboard interface on her screen to actually edit the film that we watched using the Apple software that we were shown. So I think both of those are great examples and great challenges to the way it's very easy for us to assume that everybody is accessing content, everybody's the same as we are. So everybody's using a mouse, everybody's using their fingers on a mobile device. So I think keyboard accessibility for me, as I say, that's one of the reasons I think it's so important, because it really challenges the way, you know, the the kind of tendency that we have of thinking that everybody is accessing, which is quite normal, but thinking that everybody is doing things the way that we do them. So how do we make sure that both of these people are able to access our learning content using a keyboard? So the guideline, again, it just basically says to us that all of the interaction that we use in our learning content to be accessible, to be meeting the requirements, needs to be keyboard compatible. But what does that actually mean? So again, if we take it back to our Bagar activity, our user in-your-face activity, if anyone had tried to access that content, or if you try it when you maybe you go home and you try on a laptop or on a desktop to actually access that content with a keyboard, you would actually find that it isn't keyboard accessible. There are a few things, a few activities, or a few interactivities, I should say, in that content which are accessible. One example that you can see here, I don't know if that's behind Michael, is the link, the Bagar link itself. You can see that that has what we call a visible focus indicator around it, which shows us that that is keyboard accessible. So if you are not familiar with keyboard accessible and you want to have a try of it, I would suggest that you maybe start with an accessible website, maybe something like the BBC home site, which is a very good accessible website, and have a go at using keyboard accessibility. So what that means is you simply use your keyboard, you use the tab key on your keyboard, which will jump you from an interactivity to an interactivity. If it is keyboard accessible, you will see this visible focus indicator around the interactivity. And once it's actually selected, once you've selected it using the tab key, you can then simply use the space key or enter, and that will activate the content. And that's what we mean by keyboard accessibility. And as I say, if you had a go at the Bagar that activity, or you have a go at it, you will notice that most of the activity, most of the forms that you are filling in, most of the fields you are filling in, are not actually keyboard accessible. So again, if we translate that to learning, what do we need to do? What do we need to be aware of? Really, keyboard accessibility and how that works is the responsibility of the authoring tool. So there's nothing really that we can do that can go into the underlying coding and make something keyboard accessible if it isn't. But what we can do is we have a choice about what type of interactivity we are using in our content. So this is an example from Storyline. And you can see here, this is a multiple choice question. And a multiple choice question, you can see it is keyboard accessible. You can see, for example, each of the options that I have here have got that visible focus indicator. So I can select them using the tab. And equally, the submit button is also keyboard accessible. So again, I can activate that whole activity. It is keyboard accessible. However, what our responsibility is as learning practitioners is to understand the tools and understand the limitations of our tools, because it's very likely that not every interactivity that your tool provides is accessible. So a really good example is drag and drops, and that's something that we tend to talk about a lot when we're talking about accessibility, is the fact that drag and drops are not accessible, because if you imagine someone using a keyboard, they're not able to drag those objects around the screen and drop them to be able to answer the question. So it's really important that you are aware of which activities or interactivity in your learning tool is accessible, and to avoid using the ones that are inaccessible, or maybe if you want to provide an alternative, if you do want to have an activity that you know, unfortunately, because of the tool limitations, isn't accessible, then you always have the alternative to provide a different option for somebody who is who is a keyboard only user. But that doesn't mean that accessibility is something that limits our creativity. And that, I think, is one of the, again, another huge assumption that we make about that we make about accessibility in our industry. We have this idea that if we make something accessible, it can't be engaging and it can't be interactive. And that's really another one of these assumptions that we really want to challenge, another myth that we want to challenge. So to do that, just to give you an example, this is an interactivity that was in a learning resource that I put together using Storyline, and there was a really good reason for having a drag and drop activity. So the idea was that the game was for overseas students who we were trying to encourage them to use recycling bins, to actually put things in recycling bins. So it was really important that we got this idea of actually putting things in bins. We were trying to kind of change the behaviour of the fact that maybe they weren't so familiar with recycling. So there was a really good learning reason for having this drag and drop interactivity. So I really wanted to include it, but also make it accessible. So what I did was just use, the interaction was a multiple option in Storyline, which is also keyboard accessible. And I just combined that with some motion paths, so that if someone was selecting the option, when they selected it, there was still that movement into the bin that we wanted to have, but it wasn't keyboard dependent. So they were still, remember that keyboard accessibility is, the people who are using keyboard accessibility have got a motor access need, but they are visual, generally visual learners, so they can see, and that's exactly what we wanted to recreate. So the idea was that to create that, it was still, you can see here, it was accessible. Again, it was keyboard accessible, and it was also accessible to people who were using screen readers as well. So again, just an example to try and kind of counter that myth that accessibility leads to limitation. What it leads to, I believe, is actually creativity. It leads to innovation. It leads you to rethink, to unlearn everything that you know as a learning practitioner, unlearn it, relearn it, and then think empathetically. So all of the, the content that I see for people who've created accessible learning content is better learning because it's empathetic. It has that at its heart. You're thinking about your learners and you're wanting to create a really great learner experience for them. So that moves us on to cognitive considerations. And so we've got 2 for this one. The 2 that we're going to be looking at are time limits and also moving elements in content. Both of them are, again, key accessibility principles to be aware of. So the first one we're going to look at is timing. And I don't know how many of you found the incessant messages telling you how long you were taking really irritating and frustrating when you were doing that activity. Just a show of hands. So the majority of people did find that really irritating. But here's the thing, that really, you probably noticed in the activity that there really was no time limit at all. So that wasn't really a time limit that you had. It was just something there to kind of put the pressure on you and to make you kind of stressed as you were doing that particular activity. And that, I think, for me is a key message, again, when we translate that to learning, because having a time limit imposed when you are doing an activity, for some people can be a real barrier. So what I've got here is from the case study, from the Designing Learning, the book that I wrote, Designing Accessible Learning Content, and it's from a designer called Luke Westwood, who actually has learning disabilities as a child, and he still struggles with some kind of some activities now. So he became a learning practitioner because he was so fed up with doing really difficult learning. He wanted to make it better. So that's why he decided to become a learning practitioner. And what he says about time limits, I think, is really important, really telling. He says, "I know from experience that I need more time to understand and process questions and tasks than many other people. Having a time limit imposed just makes me feel stressed and anxious." So for me, when I was interviewing Luke for this, it was kind of like a moment where the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up, because everything he was saying about assessments and things that he found difficult were things that I had done in the past. So I was it really, really made me challenge my practice and think, well, why am I doing this? What's the reason for doing that? So again, if we look at the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, they can be really helpful. So what they say is that really we don't need to impose a time limit unless we give our learners control over the time limit, so that they have the opportunity to actually change. So they can, for example, either turn them off, adjust them, or extend them. There is an exception in the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines that say if there is a real-time reason for having a time limit, then that's fine to impose. Now, I have to say, I've always struggled to find a really good example of this. The one that they came up with, I think it was because I was watching that series Chernobyl at the time, it was having to deactivate a nuclear reactor in a certain amount of time. But if anyone can come up with something which is a bit more realistic, then I'd love to hear that example, so I don't need to continue using that one. But as I say, that is an exception to the rule. So I think that's a really useful point to be aware of. And again, if we look at how we can apply this using our authoring tools, obviously a lot of our authoring tools will give us control. So this is an example from the iSpring authoring tool that just allows us to control whether we have a time limit or not. So the AAA recommendation is not, as I say, to impose a time limit at all. So I say that lots of the authoring tools we use have the flexibility to allow us to decide whether we're going to impose time limits. Okay, so moving on to the next issue is moving content. Okay, and again, we had another great example from User in Your Face, was these flashing buttons. Again, they weren't really there for any reason other than they were there to distract us and frustrate us. And again, how many people found that moving content on the screen quite distracting?
I missed that. And so that was from the pop-up.
Yeah, actually the pop-up moves as well, so that's probably the better example. And the pop-up moved down really slowly as well, which was really frustrating, yeah. It's all right, not at all, though. So, yeah, so the moving content on that screen was, for a lot of people, really, for me, I know that was really frustrating. But imagine if that moving content is beyond frustrating, if that moving content actually stops you interacting with the other content on the page. And that's really common for people who may have some kind of neurodiversity. So, for example, ADHD is really common to be actually distracted by that. Yes?
Sorry.
Oh, no problem.
Just say the similar thing applies if you're doing a presentation,
Yeah.
lots of moving in your slides that's not really needed, like lots of animation and transitions and all that stuff.
I agree. Some people find that very distracting, yes. So it is using it in, you know, being mindful again, being empathetic of the fact that is there a reason for this? And I think with a presentation, I agree with you. Sometimes it's even easier as a learning practitioner to think, is there a learning reason for doing this? Is there a reason I have this, you know, this transition or this flashing? You know, some people will think, yes, it's, you know, keeping my learners awake. But if you're using that to keep them awake, then for me, that's not part of a good learning experience. So as I say, that's a really good point. Yeah, so coming back to what the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines tell us about moving content, what we need to be aware of, I'd like you to kind of process this one. I'm going to read it out to you because you need it for the next activity. So the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines says we need to make sure that learners can pause, stop or hide any content which starts automatically, moves, scrolls or blinks for longer than 5 seconds and appears alongside other content. And that is my plain English translation from the book of that guideline, I have to say. So what I'm going to ask you to do now, the final activity of this session, is I want you to imagine that rather than being learning practitioners, you are actually now accessibility auditors. So you are going to get a piece of learning content with a slide in it, and I want you to tell me whether that is going to pass or fail this particular standard. So this is something that we do a lot at Ella Hub. We do a lot of e-learning accessibility auditing. So as I say, if you can now all have a look at this slide. When you access this slide, that movement starts automatically. And it lasts for longer than 5 seconds. And you can see it also appears alongside other content. Sorry, I don't know why it keeps moving to that. So I'll leave it at that. So, okay, so let's have a look at whether you think that passes or fails the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. If you think it passes, put your hand up. Okay, if you think it fails, put your hand up. If you're not sure, put your hand up. Okay, so someone who thinks it passes, again, could you put your hand up? Could you tell us why you think it passes?
I presume the pause button at the bottom does actually function as a pause button.
It does.
Pause.
Yes, and that's a good question. I didn't actually show you that. So you have to believe that actually that pause function works. But in actual fact, that for me is correct. That would pass because you are giving the learner control. So somebody who finds movement distracting and is trying to read the content on that slide, they could pause that moving globe, and that would be fine. That would be able that would pass the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Apologies, I didn't show you actually someone using that pause button. I thought it might be a little bit too obvious, but I think it would have been useful. So that is a really common error that we see, a really common violation of the WCAG principles when we are doing auditing. So it's something, again, that I want you to take away from this session. Maybe go back and have a look at your learning content. See if you can find any examples of anything that's moving as again, longer than 5 seconds, alongside other content that you are not giving your learners control over, and seeing if you can find any examples and of anything else that we've shown you in the session as well. Michael?
Okay, so thanks, Susie. So that brings us to near the end of the session, where we're just going to kind of summarise some key takeaways that we would like to leave you with. One of the first things I would recommend that everybody check out is a set of posters that have been commissioned by the UK Home Office. And like we have done in this presentation, and as you see on the leaflets on your chest, these have been broken down by accessibility need. And this is something I'd really recommend that every office kind of download a copy of the posters and make them available. Share them with your team, because it's a really fabulous resource, not just for your learning, but just any kind of digital content. The next takeaway is that if you're serious about making content accessible using the best practices for the web guidelines, then checking out the e-learning accessibility framework is a great place to start. And all you need to do isn't, as you saw with the massive list of guidelines, is just start somewhere. So just take one step at a time, give and commit to doing something. So take one action. So maybe address your text, address your images, and start adding alt text. And the next takeaway is just one reminder of the fantastic impact that removing barriers to everyone has in digital content, including learning, can have. And this is from Web Accessibility Steve Krug, who says, "The argument for accessibility, which doesn't get nearly made often enough, is how extraordinarily better it makes some people's lives." So how many opportunities do we actually get in learning to dramatically improve people's lives just by doing our jobs better? Which brings us to our final point of this session. And that's simply a call to action. So thinking about the things we've shared with you today, what is your one commitment? What is it you're going to do off the back of this session? And if you look on the back of the leaflets on the decks, you can actually write something down if you'd like to make notes, and just make that commitment visible. So share it with your team, let the people back in the office place know what you're doing, and if you're feeling brave, share it on Twitter as well. Make it a public thing. Because ultimately, one the thing we want you to work with is that together we really can make a difference. We really can change the world by making things more accessible one step at a time.
Thank you, Mike and Susie. I think it'd be really good if you just turned to the person next to you and very quickly just said what you think you can do differently. So just 1 minute, turn to the person next to you and tell them what your action might be. Okay, that was an amazing sound of inspired people. Thank you for doing that. I think that was making both Mike and Susie very happy. Are there any questions? Has anybody in the audience got questions? And if they have, I'll come round the speaker so you can be heard.
Hi, I just wanted to give you a real-life example of your Chernobyl. I train soldiers for the MOD, and one of the things we do is we don't give them any extra time for the work that they produce if they have dyslexia or dyscalculia, because when they're in the battlefield, if they have to produce a map or cartography, that is time pressured, and if they cannot complete their job in that time, then they need to look at whether they're in the right trade. So it's a really interesting concept.
Yeah, no, that's a really great example. Thank you. I'll use that one in the future. Yeah.
So we've got quite a range of instructional designers in our organisation. They don't all come under one team, they're all separated out, and they're all very passionate about it. And this is kind of our year of trying to get our content more accessible. We kind of acknowledge that we're not doing a very good job in that space. How do you support a diverse range of people across multiple countries, multiple languages, multiple experience backgrounds, and very different opinions about creativity and what they can do, trying to kind of get them on this journey around accessibility when it is very terrifying, as you've mentioned, those kind of WCAG guidelines. What's your advice on trying to get people on board and supporting them to understand the steps they can take?
So I think one of the things for me in working with the clients that we've worked with is just really getting a kind of like a base level before you start. So being very clear. So if you say, okay, you know, in our organisation there might not be a legal requirement to meet all of the web content accessibility guidelines, or we have some we have some reasons that means that we're not able to achieve everything, to actually kind of identify what it is that you want to make accessible, how accessible you want it to be, and also to have this idea that accessibility, you do need to be very pragmatic about accessibility. So it looks, when you look at the examples that we've given, and when you look at the kind of guidelines, it does look like it's a really tick box. You know, you're either accessible or you're not accessible. I think if you have a pragmatic approach to make things as accessible as possible, so a really useful tool that I always recommend people to is to consider having an accessibility statement. And having an accessibility statement is something that actually is a legal requirement. So, for example, if you're in the public sector, part of those public sector bodies' accessibility regulations stipulated that you have to have an accessibility statement. But rather than seeing that as a kind of, it's something else that I need to do, an accessibility statement allows you to kind of accommodate. So it's really difficult to make something 100% accessible for every single different type of access need, every single person using a different type of assistive technology in combination with every single browser, for example. So if you have an accessibility statement, you can actually, the purpose of it really, the purpose of what we're trying to do is make people's experience better. So if you can just give people a kind of like guidelines, any limitations, anything that you can't make accessible for the limitations of the tool, the limitations of what your clients are asking for, or because of the way that you're working, and you're honest about that, and you're basically trying to help people. And a really key component of that accessibility statement is having a contact, and for me that is absolutely essential. So if you have an organisational contact, if someone can't access the content for any reason, they have got somewhere to go, and it's almost like someone is doing the testing for you. Again, it's very difficult to kind of test everything. So I think it's that kind of pragmatic approach, being really clear up front. And from the point of view of getting people on board, a lot of the things that we've done in the training today is to have that kind of empathy piece. It isn't just about meeting these requirements. It is about making things better for everybody, making it a better learner experience, and really accommodating and helping people who just need things to be done slightly differently. It's not kind of rocket science. It's just kind of making things better. So, making things, it's progress rather than perfection, I think, with accessibility. It's really difficult to make something and to say up front, this is 100% accessible.
And shout about the things your team are doing as well. So if you're using like Slack channels and your team are doing great work, to shout about it and encourage that kind of behaviour, because that should encourage the other team to kind of get involved and do their bit as well.
Okay, I think we've got time for a couple more questions. We've got one right at the back, so this will be very good.
Thank you for such a wonderful talk. I wanted to hear your thoughts about people who are testing for people with disabilities. So a lot of the time when we are testers who are using JAWS or screen readers are actually able themselves, and is that a realistic situation?
I think it's always a great place to start, but it's by no means an exhaustive example. So as you've heard in some of the other talks as well, you always need to be testing with the target audience. So whilst using kind of color contrast checkers, whilst using tools that are, like as you say, using JAWS yourselves, is a great place to get started, but that is no substitution for actually testing with a real audience. So I'd always recommend actually going down that route, if achievable. If you go onto things like YouTube as well, you can test and kind of watch people with disabilities interacting with the content, but that's no substitute for actually talking to people, and having live audiences. And I think that there are a number of people who are willing to volunteer those kind of services. I'm not saying they should give away their time for free, but there's a number of places where you can kind of source that testing with real people. So I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, so I think it's probably useful to kind of share our experience of when we're creating learning content. So we do the content that we create, we do very basic tests. I'm a really basic screen reader user, so I will test using the NVDA screen reader, which is free and open source. Everybody can access that screen reader. I will use it for testing really basic things, such as whether I've remembered to put the alt text on, whether I've forgotten to to turn it off on things, and also whether my focus order is correct, and all those types of things. And actually, I have to say this a bit of an aside, but actually doing screen reader testing for me is a way of proofreading my content. So it's a really valuable exercise for me to go through. I find it much easier to listen to my content and see the mistakes than trying to read them. I kind of read what I think what I've written in instead of what I actually have. But the point about using someone who has a lived experience of a disability and is used to has been using that technology for considerable amount of time, is that what you get from that is the richer experience. So I work with someone who is a JAWS user, a screen reader user, but she is also a trainer. She trains online. She's a German. She trains German online. And so she has that L&D background, and what she gives me is she can say, well, yes, this works from a screen reader. I can make that, I can make it work, but it really is a terrible learner experience. She gives you that extra kind of the extra focus or the extra lens really of what actually that piece of learning is like. So a good example for something is, something that I've done before is given her, or she's looked at, when she's auditing, she's looked at a multiple choice option which has got a huge amount of different options, I don't know, 10 or 11 different answers. She has to process. So if you imagine what the question is asking at the point, she has to remember that. You think of your visual, you can go back to the question. She has to kind of process that. And so just for me, that was a huge eye-opener, and it really kind of gave that extra perspective on whether this is actually a good learner experience rather than just whether we're ticking the boxes. So if it's possible, and I really recommend what Michael was saying, is finding people who have got a lived experience of a disability, and particularly if they're assistive technology users as well, that's really, really helpful.
Okay, I know there are probably some more questions. Susie will be around. She's doing a Meet the Author session just after this, I think, over lunchtime. So please, if you have got questions, ask Susie. What I would like to do now is to just round up with your help. So if you have been inspired by this session and are going back to work tomorrow or Monday to do something different, please stand up and stay standing. Oh, some very good bouncing there. That's even better. If you are curious and think, I'm going to explore this a little bit further, I'm not sure there's anybody sitting down, then please stand up and stay standing. If you're still skeptical but are going to keep an open mind, then please stand up and stay standing. So I think that's everybody. So what I'd like you to do now is give Susie and Mike a huge round of applause.